like one of those friends who always pushed a man forward into the fight, telling him he was bound to win, cheering him on, sure, but really just wanting to watch the fool get his ass kicked. Dannon had been that fool more than once. He didn't intend on being it again. Better to be a new kind of fool, for the variety of the thing. He sighed as the shouting continued, taking another pull from his ale. Then he noticed a young man, maybe not even in his 20s, rising from a nearby table where he'd been sitting with some of his friends. There was a determined look in his eyes, one Dannon recognized all too well, and he grunted wearily as he watched the man's friends try to pull him back down into his chair. The man, however, if a youth with a mustache thinner than some women's Dannon had seen could be called a man, knocked his friend's hands away. He rose and gripped the handle of a sword sheathed at his side, a blade which, judging by the ornate, ridiculously tasseled scabbard, was as useless as the man was terrified. But terrified or not, the young man shouted, "Unhand her!" in a voice that might have been more intimidating if it had squeaked a little less. Dannon rubbed at his eyes. Unhand her. Who spoke like that, anyway? Nobody except those shining, blonde-headed heroes in storybooks. The young man's mother had probably read him when he was a child, like a week ago. Dannon took another drink of his ale, watching the boy make his way toward the crowd, which began to part for him, opening up a space with indecent haste, those milling men and women eager to see the blood that would inevitably follow. The crowd's parting revealed 3 men and one of the tavern's serving women. The woman's back was pressed against a table, and one of the men was pawing at her bodice, trying to undo the laces at her breasts, but fumbling them in his haste. The man's 2 companions, however, had turned to regard the challenger. Big men, each of them, with enough scars on their forearms and faces to show that though they might not have been the best fighters out there, they certainly had far more experience than the would-be hero. "The fuck you say, boy?" one asked, grinning, and revealing a mouth that was missing more teeth than it had. Another indication had one been needed of the man's experience in brawls. The young man glanced back at his table as if for help, but his friends all seemed possessed of a suddenly dire need to look anywhere but at him. The hero wilted somewhat, his shoulders slumping at perhaps his first realization, certainly not his last, that the world was no storybook. Dannon had the brief hope that he would leave it. In real life, after all, most of the heroes were dead, and the villains almost always won. But the young man rallied, calling on what courage and foolishness he possessed, squaring his shoulders and meeting the grinning man's gaze as best he could. I said—" he paused, clearing his throat. "I said unhand her." "And if we don't?" the man asked, obviously as eager as the would-be hero was afraid. The boy's fingers flitted at the hilt of his sword, like a moth around a flame, wanting to draw it just as the moth wanted to touch the blaze. Never mind that they'd each get burned for their trouble. "Don't, you damned fool," Dannon thought. Without the sword, the boy would probably walk away with a black eye or 2, maybe a few bruises, and one priceless understanding that he wasn't a hero. That no one was, really. All in all, Dannon thought he'd be the better for it. But if he drew the blade, the black eye would be the least of his problems. He could see the boy thinking about it, weighing his options, deciding whether his pride could survive backing down. Dannon would have told him, had he asked, that it could survive far more than that. He ought to know, after all, his own pride had long since become little more than a withered